I froze when I saw my wife kissing another man in front of me at the company party. It was as if time had split in half, leaving me in slow motion, watching every detail of that betrayal unfold as if it were meticulously planned torture. The lights in the room seemed to mock me, swirling in shades of red and gold as she smiled, giving her lips to someone who wasn't me, someone who, until that moment, I hadn't even known existed in our story. The glass of whiskey I held trembled in my hand, almost slipping away, as if the glass itself couldn't withstand the pain piercing my chest. She hadn't known I'd be there. She had no idea I'd changed my mind at the last minute and decided to show up as a surprise. Maybe because I wanted to see her shine, maybe because something inside me still tried to reignite what was already fading, even though I denied it. When our eyes finally met, it was as if the universe had stopped spinning for a second. The smile on her face faded, the sparkle in her eyes evaporated, and she stood there, paralyzed, with her mouth half open, not knowing what to do, as if only in that moment had she understood the magnitude of the mistake she was making. She came toward me, stumbling over her words, saying it meant nothing, that it was an impulse, a mistake, a mix-up, that there was no feeling involved, that I didn't understand. But how could I not understand? What else did I need to see beyond that kiss? It wasn't the touch of our lips that hurt, it was the abandonment. It was the disregard for our history, the disrespect for everything we'd built, for every night we'd slept hand in hand, for every plan we'd made under the same roof. She spoke as if there was still time, as if there was still a way back, but something inside me was already slipping away. I just turned and left, silently, without shouting, without confronting, without giving her what she probably expected, a scandal, a fight, tears. No. I took the pain home with me, letting it eat away at me as I folded my shirts, one by one, crying softly as I packed each item. Because each item was a memory, a snapshot of a time when I believed we were on the same side. That night, something inside me died. But something was also born. The decision to move on. To not beg for love, to not ask for explanations from someone who wasn't even considerate enough to wait for my absence. I filed for divorce the next day. I signed the papers with trembling hands, my eyes still red, but my heart trying to find its place amidst the wreckage. It wasn't easy. Nothing was easy. The following days were the longest of my life. Every silence in the house reminded me of her laughter, every corner of the apartment reminded me of some detail from our past. I found myself talking to the walls, wondering when everything was lost. And the answer came like a cold blade, the moment she chose someone other than me. But time, though cruel, is also a silent sculptor. It slowly reshaped me, day after day, until an unexpected reunion brought me back to myself. An old love from my youth. Someone I thought had remained in another chapter, another life. We began to talk, cautiously, like someone stepping onto new ground after a long journey. We discovered there was still much there, perhaps not the same youthful flame as before, but a maturity, a recognition, an understanding of who we are after so many scars. And from this connection something beautiful was born. Simple. Peaceful. A relationship without games, without insecurities, without empty promises. Meanwhile, the woman who once swore to love me plunged into a cycle of failed attempts. She dated one person, then another, laughed out loud on social media, but behind the filters and self-help phrases, there was emptiness. The relationships didn't last. They lacked depth. What we had, which she threw away as if it were replaceable, was missing. What took her a while to understand, and perhaps only understood too late, is that true love isn't found on every corner. True love isn't thrown away out of curiosity or need. True love requires courage to resist temptations, bad times, and silences. And she didn't have it. The day she came to me, her eyes teary and her face drawn, begging for forgiveness, was the day I knew I was whole again. I listened to her. I let her speak. She trembled as she said she regretted it, that she lost me over a stupid thing, that nothing made sense since I left her life. She cried. She asked for another chance. She said she understood now. But I was no longer the same man. And she was no longer the woman I loved. I forgave her. Because forgiving is freeing yourself. Because holding a grudge would be chaining me to a past that no longer belonged to me. But forgiving isn't going back. And she understood. Late, but she understood. She saw in my eyes that I was no longer waiting for her. That my heart, though still somewhat scarred, was already beating for someone else. That my life was headed in a different direction. That the man who had once loved her with everything he had was now someone else, stronger, more aware, more whole. The cruelest punishment wasn't my indifference, nor my absence. It was my peace. Because she realized, then, that the love she'd lost was exactly what she'd been searching for in all others. And that now it existed, but not for her. And the most piercing irony was realizing that what she thought she could win back with tears and words was precisely what is built with years of trust and respect. She wanted to reap what she burned. And all she found was ash. I still remember her look at that last meeting, as if she wanted to scream what pride wouldn't let her. And I, silently, just wished her happiness, truly, because sometimes the deepest forgiveness is the one that expects no return. It's what frees only one of us. And that night, upon returning home, I lay on the chest of the one who now shares my days and understood that there is pain that teaches us to love better. That there are hearts that break to rebuild stronger. And that there are losses that are deliverances. But the most curious thing of all, is that this story still holds one last truth. A truth that neither she nor I expected. Because fate, subtly and silently, planted something back then, something that would only come to light when it was too late. And when it finally did, everything that seemed resolved was turned upside down. And it was there, exactly there, that she understood there was no going back. No chance. No salvation. Just the inevitable consequence of a choice. Welcome to the channel. Here, no type of betrayal is romanticized or encouraged. The stories you will hear are fictional, but reflect real pain, choices, and consequences. Our goal is clear, to show how betrayal destroys homes, breaks hearts, and changes destinies forever. Prepare to immerse yourself in an intense narrative, full of emotion, regret, and lasting lessons. Now take a deep breath. Because what comes next is a shocking story. From their first meeting, there was something between Daniel and Clara that defied logic. It wasn't just the easy flow of their words or the natural comfort of the silence between them, it was the way they seemed to recognize each other even without truly knowing each other. They first met in a local bookstore, both vying for the last copy of a novel that would only please readers with the patience for dense stories. And perhaps that was it, they both had patience. Patience to delve into long stories, to listen without interrupting, to wait for the right time for each thing. That's how it began, an accidental stumble between shelves, a shy smile, and a conversation that lasted hours, interrupted only by the store's closing sign. Daniel was a man with a serene look in his eyes, but not because he'd lived a short life. Quite the opposite. He'd experienced losses, sudden changes, and loves that left more doubts than certainties, but he'd learned to deal with life's silences with a rare maturity. He worked in systems planning, a profession that demanded control, predictability, and logic, the opposite of his feelings for Clara, which from the start were anything but predictable. Clara, on the other hand, brought with her a restless energy. She was intense in everything, in love, in her opinions, in her decisions. She had a spontaneous air, a subtle sense of humor, a sparkle in her eyes that changed the mood, but also a hidden fragility that she only revealed when she was certain she would be welcomed. The two complemented each other in an almost didactic way. Daniel was the balance, Clara was the drive. He planned, she improvised. He organized the days, she filled them with surprises. They lived in a modest apartment decorated with a jumble of stacked books, unframed paintings, and plants that Clara insisted on tending, even though she had no gift for gardening. They discussed old movies, shared Sunday coffees, and laughed at their own quirks. It was a life built calmly, without great luxuries, but with affection in every gesture. Daniel liked to make breakfast on weekends, while Clara read the news aloud, interrupting her reading to comment on political absurdities or some unusual gossip. These were small moments, but when added together, they formed the greatness of their relationship. Friends always saw them as a stable couple. One who seemed to have overcome the barriers of time and routine. Clara used to say that Daniel was her point of peace, the place where she rested from the excesses of the world. And he said she was his favorite storm, the one that messed everything up but in the end made sense. And she really did. There were arguments, of course. No real relationship is made of nothing but calm. They fought over trivial things, forgetting a date, the tone of voice in a conversation, the division of tasks. But in the end, there was always a genuine effort to reconcile, a concern not to sleep with a heavy heart, an urgency to say, "I'm sorry," before the silence became a wall. Clara had a solid career in the events industry, always interacting with people, leading teams, and dealing with unexpected situations. Daniel admired the way she managed to resolve everything assertively, as if she were born to maintain control amidst chaos. She knew how to listen, but she also knew how to assert herself. She had charisma, and it was easy to see how much she was loved by her colleagues and friends. Daniel, more reserved, watched from afar, without feeling jealous, at least not openly. He knew she shone, and that was part of what enchanted him. But, like all bright lights, she sometimes overshadowed. And although he never admitted it, there were times when he felt small compared to her ability to be the center of everything. Over time, life began to settle into patterns. They woke up at the same time, drank the same coffee, exchanged kisses before leaving, texted each other mid-work, and at night watched a series before bed. It was comfortable, but also predictable. And although Daniel saw the beauty of stability in this, Clara began to miss something she couldn't even name. It wasn't a lack of love. It wasn't disinterest. It was an inner restlessness, a longing for something more, even if she didn't yet know exactly what that more was. On their anniversary, Clara always wrote long notes, full of sweet words and reflections on how much their relationship had helped her grow. Daniel kept them all, each one in a wooden box he kept in his closet, as if it were possible to collect certainties. In the last few notes, however, the words began to change. They were still affectionate, but less intense. More reflective than passionate. Daniel, sensitive as he was, noticed, but decided not to question it. He thought it was just a phase, a byproduct of everyday weariness. After all, everyone went through this. And he believed that true love endured moments of emotional distance. It never occurred to him that love could fade away in silence. At home, Sundays were still warm and peaceful. She still curled up on his lap to watch movies, still laughed at his jokes at dinner, still said, "I love you," when he hung up the phone. But some days, Daniel began to notice that her eyes lingered a second longer than usual. As if searching for something and missing. Other days, she would get lost in thought in the middle of a conversation and come back pretending she'd understood everything. Little things. Things that, taken alone, meant nothing. But taken together, they began to weigh heavily. Clara, meanwhile, was increasingly immersed in her professional commitments. Large projects, late meetings, short but frequent trips. Daniel always supported her with admiration. He was never the controlling type, so she never felt the need to justify every move. But there was a growing, invisible distance, and they both seemed unaware. They pretended to still be on the same wavelength, when they were already dancing to different tunes. When the company party was scheduled, Clara commented with little enthusiasm, saying it would be just another formal event, the kind with forced smiles and marketing photos. Daniel hesitated before saying he couldn't go because of a work commitment. She nodded without insistence. Deep down, perhaps they both knew there was something there beyond the agenda. An unfilled gap. A void of unspoken words. But even so, that night before the party, they had dinner together, shared a glass of wine, talked about the weather, laughed at some silly thing a mutual friend had said. Everything seemed fine. It seemed so. Because life's biggest ruptures don't usually give clear signals. They come like earthquakes that announce themselves in imperceptible tremors, until everything collapses all at once. And when that happens, there's no warning. Only the silence that follows the internal screams of those left behind. Daniel fell asleep before her that night. He woke in the middle of the night to find her in the living room, sitting on the sofa, staring into her own teacup as if searching for an answer. He approached, stroked her hair, and asked if everything was okay. She smiled with a strange weariness and said yes, it was just insomnia. He believed her. Or chose to believe. Because sometimes, the worst pain isn't the one imposed on us. It's the one we choose not to see, even when it's already staring us in the face. The next day dawned cloudy, and the city seemed to reflect the interior atmosphere of that house. Clara left early, with her briefcase and a hurried kiss. Daniel stayed home, absorbed in commitments and scattered thoughts. He spent the day with a feeling he couldn't name. It was as if something was about to happen, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. That night, he made a decision. He changed his mind and decided to go to the party. Not out of distrust, but out of longing. Out of a desire to see her smile among so many people, to surprise her, to perhaps rekindle some forgotten spark. And that was the decision. That changed everything. The hall's entrance was decorated with warm lights and elegant floral arrangements that contrasted with the warm night air. Daniel arrived later than expected, having cancelled a work appointment that, truthfully, could have waited. Deep down, there was a growing uneasiness since the morning, a subtle foreboding he couldn't quite name. Dressed simply but neatly, he crossed the lobby amid scattered greetings and mechanical smiles, feeling a little out of place in this environment where everything seemed designed to impress. He didn't see her right away. He walked slowly, observing the people, the outfits, the toasts, searching for that familiar face amid the artificial glow of the flashes and background music. The loud music, the exaggerated laughter, the conversations interrupted by the sound of clinking glasses, everything was strange, as if he were entering a world he no longer belonged to. When his eyes finally found her, she was laughing. It was a light laugh, a little louder than usual at home, and her shoulders were tilted forward, as if surrendering to someone's presence. He didn't see the man's face right away, just his hands gesturing close to her body, his confident posture, and a certain magnetism in the way he seemed to conduct the conversation. Clara wore a dark dress that elegantly outlined her curves, and although it was discreet, Daniel had never seen her in that style before. She said something while the man responded with a wide smile, as if they shared an intimacy built in silence. Still, he hesitated. He considered going to her, surprising her with a kiss, wrapping his arms around her waist as he used to, but something kept him still, his feet firmly planted on the ground, his heart racing at a new rate. She decided to observe. For a few seconds, which seemed eternal, she stood there, like an invisible spectator at a play she didn't quite understand. Then, the gesture. A simple yet devastating movement. The man leaned in slowly, his fingers brushing her waist, and she didn't flinch. Their faces drew closer, and before he could react, their lips touched in a kiss that wasn't friendship, nor impromptu. It was a confident, intimate kiss, charged with something that only develops with frequency and familiarity. There was no hesitation. And there was no trace of resistance in Clara. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't impulse. It was choice. Daniel's stomach tightened as if he'd been punched. His breath hitched, and for a moment, everything around him faded. He could no longer hear the music, the laughter, the footsteps. Only the muffled sound of his own heart beating against his chest. The glass of sparkling wine he was holding slipped from his fingers and shattered on the floor, but no one noticed. He took a step back, unable to blink, unable to speak. It was as if the world had shifted on its axis, and he was falling into a silent abyss. She hadn't seen him yet. He was still laughing, still talking, as if time hadn't stopped. When Clara's eyes finally met his, the expression on her face changed in an instant. Not one of immediate guilt, but of astonishment. As if she hadn't anticipated the possibility of him being there. As if, for a moment, she'd forgotten he was still a part of her life. She walked away from the man slowly, unable to hide the panic that settled in her eyes. She walked toward Daniel with short, quick steps, her smile disappearing completely, her hands gesturing in the air as if trying to stop him from escaping. She called to him, tried to say something, perhaps to explain, but her words came out choked and incoherent. He stared at her with empty eyes, he didn't shout, didn't move suddenly, just watched. She told him it meant nothing, that it was a mistake, a misunderstanding. That he didn't understand. But he did. And that was exactly what hurt. Without answering, Daniel turned and left. The night outside seemed colder than it was. He walked the streets as if in a trance, his steps heavy, his thoughts in disarray. When he got home, he sat on the edge of the bed and remained there for long minutes, motionless. His hands rested on his knees, his eyes fixed on nothing. The silence inside the apartment was deafening, and only then did he realize he was crying. Not with despair, but with that dull sadness that slowly destroys. The betrayal wasn't just the kiss. It was the shattering of everything they had been building. It was the crumbling of their shared effort, of the love nurtured for years, of the sacrifices made in the name of a life together. Hours later, he began packing. Every folded shirt, every book chosen, every photograph left behind was an act of farewell. There were no shouts, no anger. Only pain and a decision. It was a silent goodbye, without notes, without explanations. Because, for him, what had happened could not be explained. When Clara arrived, late at night, she found the door ajar, the lights on, and the room empty. She called out to him, but received no answer. She walked through the rooms with anxious steps, until she found the closet half open, the shelves almost empty, and the suitcase he had left in the corner of the hallway. Beside it, an envelope with documents. The completed divorce petition, and nothing else. No letter, no message. Just absence. The silence, now, was hers. In the following days, she tried to reach him. She sent long messages, left dozens of missed calls. She said she needed to talk, that she wanted to explain herself, that things weren't what they seemed. But he remained silent. He didn't block her, didn't react, he simply walked away. Like someone who understands, once and for all, that there are wounds that shouldn't be reopened. Clara, for her part, wavered between despair and disbelief. She hadn't imagined he'd leave so quickly, so determinedly. She thought she'd have time, that one conversation would be enough. But what she didn't understand was that betrayal isn't just through gestures. It's through choices, through oversights, through permissions. And Daniel didn't want explanations. He wanted peace. Even so, she persisted. She showed up in front of the building where he was temporarily staying, tried to approach him as he was leaving work, sent letters, gifts, and audio recordings of her crying and pleading. She told him she loved him, that she missed him, that she'd made a mistake and didn't know how to fix it. But he didn't respond. Not out of spite, but out of survival instinct. Each attempt reopened wounds he'd barely begun to heal. And he knew that if he gave in, he'd return to a place where there was no longer room for himself. Little by little, silence fell. Clara stepped back, perhaps realizing there was nothing she could say that would undo the image of that kiss. There was no argument, no apology, no tear that could rebuild what she herself had broken. She tried to move on with her life, reconnect with work, her friends, her routine. But everything seemed to have lost its flavor. The places they used to frequent together now felt empty, the automatic gestures of everyday life became heavy. And, little by little, the penny dropped. She had destroyed what she held most dear for something that, now, made no sense. Meanwhile, Daniel sought to rebuild himself. Not in a hurry, nor with impulses. but with determination. He reflected on himself, on his choices, on the signs he ignored. He began to walk more, to allow himself new experiences, to reconnect with old contacts. It was during one of these chance encounters that he was surprised. A name he hadn't heard in a long time, a face that was part of a sweet memory, of a time when life was easier. There were no intentions. Just conversation. Then, coffee. And later, dinner. And so, slowly, something began to take shape again. Clara, silently, watched from afar. She saw photos, heard stories, felt in her heart what she might not have understood before. She realized he was smiling again. That his absence hadn't left an irreparable hole, but an opportunity for a new beginning. And that was the cruelest punishment, realizing that the man she lost, had moved on. What she didn't yet know, however, was that there was something more. Something Daniel had recently discovered, something that gave new meaning to everything they'd experienced. A hidden, silent truth that, when revealed, would put everything into a new perspective. And that moment was about to arrive. Clara stood in front of the door of her new apartment for long seconds before knocking. Her hands were sweaty, her heart pounding, and her mind whirled with everything she wanted to say but didn't know how. It had been weeks since she'd seen him up close, though she'd heard from others that he was starting over. They saw him smiling, they saw him in good company. Each piece of news like this was a new thorn in her flesh, because she had been responsible for pushing him away. But there was still a dull hope within her, that blind belief that if she could just say it all, if he would just listen to her, maybe there would be a remnant of us between them. When Daniel opened the door, the shock was immediate. He was different. Not in appearance, but in presence. The lightness in his gaze, the calm demeanor, the tensionless silence. He was the same man, but at the same time, he wasn't anymore. He invited her in kindly, not out of longing, but out of respect. And that gesture, as polite as it was cold, said much more than any words. They sat in the small room, facing each other, like two old versions of a story that would never be written again. Clara spoke first. She said she needed to close a cycle, that she couldn't move on without first truly apologizing. She begged for forgiveness, her voice breaking, and told how she'd felt since that day. She revealed that she'd lost herself, that she couldn't find herself anywhere, that nothing made sense since he left. She tried to justify the unjustifiable, not as an excuse, but as a confession. She wanted him to understand that the betrayal wasn't premeditated, that she wasn't looking for someone outside the relationship, but that she'd let herself be carried away by a moment of fragility. That there was no love on the other side, only confusion. Daniel listened attentively, without interrupting, without reacting. His silence was more eloquent than any sentence, and this made her even more nervous. When she finished, she lowered her eyes and said, almost in a whisper, that she still loved him. Daniel took a deep breath, rested his elbows on his knees, and finally spoke. He said he no longer held any anger, that he had spent sleepless nights trying to understand what he did wrong, where he failed, why he hadn't seen the signs. But he had come to the conclusion that sometimes people simply choose what they think is easier, even if it costs them something precious. He said he forgave her. And that disarmed her. She cried. She cried like never before, because she hadn't expected forgiveness, she expected resistance, perhaps an argument, or even reconciliation. But not serenity. Daniel continued, saying that forgiveness didn't mean a fresh start. That, no matter how much he had healed, there was no longer room in his path for the love he felt for her. That what they had experienced was stored in a beautiful but untouchable place. She still tried to argue, saying that people make mistakes, that true feelings remain, that what they had couldn't simply disappear. Daniel then looked into her eyes and replied that the feeling hadn't disappeared, but had transformed. That he still fondly remembered the moments they shared, but that now it belonged to another story. A story that was slowly taking shape, with someone who understood him, who made him feel whole again, without having to rebuild what had been broken. Clara felt the ground give way beneath her feet. He tried to maintain his composure, but his eyes couldn't hide the pain. That's when she asked, almost without thinking, if he already loved this new person. Daniel was silent for a moment and then answered yes. That it was different, less intense perhaps, but more mature. That it didn't involve unrealistic promises or impossible expectations, but a constant, sincere presence, and that he had rediscovered what it was to be loved lightly, without fear. Clara got up, walked to the window, and stood there looking out, trying to swallow the words she wasn't saying. She said she deserved him back, that no one knew him like she did, that no one had lived through what they had. And Daniel calmly replied that the problem was precisely that, she knew the man he was, but not the man he had become after the pain she had caused. Clara turned suddenly, her eyes brimming with tears, and asked if he had even felt anything when he saw her cry. If it hadn't hurt him to see her broken like that. Daniel then said yes, that he was still moved by her pain, but that he wasn't responsible for healing her. That path was hers, and he had already walked his own. There was a tense silence. Time seemed to stand still. She sat back down, exhausted, and finally asked if he even knew who the man she had cheated on him with was. Daniel replied that he did. But that, to him, it no longer mattered. Clara lowered her head, struggling with her own shame, but there was more. Something he didn't know. Something she had never told him. Something that could change everything, even if it was already too late. She took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and began to speak hesitantly. She said that, in truth, there was something that needed to be said, not because she expected forgiveness or redemption, but because she could no longer carry it alone. She explained that the man she'd been with, the one at the party, wasn't just a distraction, a random fling. He was someone she'd known for a long time, someone she'd been involved with even before meeting Daniel. Someone who came back into her life just as she was beginning to question everything she felt. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part, what Daniel didn't know, was that this man had reappeared for a very clear reason, to get revenge on her. The revelation fell like an avalanche. Clara said that years ago, when she was still a recent graduate, she was promoted to a highly sought-after position. And the person who lost the position to her was the sister of the man with whom she would later cheat on him. Her brother, upset by what he considered an injustice, engineered his own approach. He attended events, joined groups, bided his time to infiltrate her. And when he learned that Clara was in a solid relationship, he saw the perfect opportunity to destroy what she had built. Clara only discovered this after the fact, when the man, no longer needing to pretend, confessed everything with an ironic smile, as if completing a successful mission. He said he used her to take from her what she valued most, the love of a man of integrity. He said that now she knew what it was like to lose something because of someone else's merit. Daniel listened to her with a neutral expression, but his eyes couldn't hide the storm inside. The betrayal had been painful enough, but now it took on even more cruel dimensions. He said nothing for a while. He simply stood up, paced the room as if trying to catch his breath, and finally asked why she hadn't told him sooner. Clara replied that she was embarrassed. That she'd tried to convince herself that telling her would be worse, that it would make everything even more unbearable. But now she couldn't keep it in any longer. Daniel nodded slowly and said that everything made more sense now. The other man's actions, the look in his eyes, the discomfort he'd felt at that moment but couldn't quite interpret. The silence between them grew heavier, but there was nothing more to say. Clara asked, for the last time, if there was still a chance, if all of this, now explained, could open a new space between them. Daniel took a deep breath, looked at her firmly, and replied no. That it wasn't just the betrayal, the deception, or the cruel plan that hurt. It was the fact that she'd allowed all of this to happen while he loved her. He said he forgave her, truly, but that her memory was now a closed chapter. A scarred chapter, yes, but one he no longer wanted to reread. She stood slowly, walked to the door with heavy steps, and before leaving, turned once more. She told him she would love him for the rest of her life, even if he never returned. And he replied, gently, that he hoped she would forgive herself one day. Because, in the end, the most devastating pain is not the pain of abandonment, but the pain of recognizing one's own mistake. And then she left. And he stayed. Whole. With everything he'd learned. And with someone who, on the other side of town, was waiting for him, unaware that he was now free. Not to return to what he was, but to be what he always deserved to be. Night had already advanced when Clara left Daniel's apartment, and the overcast sky seemed to reflect the weight she carried on her shoulders. The city, which had once seemed a landscape of possibilities, was now a vast minefield of memories and regrets. She walked slowly, aimlessly, as if waiting for the pain to dissolve into the asphalt, for the streetlights to erase the shame, for some wind to carry away everything trapped between her teeth, between the words she could never say at the right time. The revelation she had made was the final letter, a desperate attempt to show that she too had been the victim of cruel manipulation, but deep down, she knew none of that changed the central fact: she had chosen to betray. Even though manipulated, even though vulnerable, she had crossed the line they had both sworn to respect. And now she was alone. For the first time, truly alone. Daniel, for his part, didn't immediately return to the rhythm of the night. He stood in the living room for long minutes, still processing everything. The details, the words, the looks, the weight of the revelations. He no longer felt anger. That wasn't the dominant feeling. There was a calm weariness, like someone who finally sees the extent of the devastated land and, even exhausted, understands there's nothing left to recover there. He looked around the apartment, the same one that now seemed different. Quieter, more spacious. Perhaps because there was only room for him inside. That conversation, though painful, had sealed something that needed to be closed. There was no longer any room for doubt. And more than that, there was, somewhere inside him, a strange sense of relief. The truth had come, not the one he expected, but the one he needed. And it freed him. Not because the suffering would cease to exist, but because it now had clear contours, a defined end. He knew exactly what to do from then on. In the following days, there were no emotional relapses. Daniel didn't seek out Clara, didn't revisit old messages, didn't impulsively reopen memories. He continued his routine, continued working, and kept focused on the little things. And it was precisely through this simple and sincere focus that he grew ever closer to Helena, the woman he had been slowly reconnecting with since that unpretentious reunion. Helena was different. She had a calmness that didn't weigh him down, a gaze that didn't judge, a listening style that didn't pressure. She didn't want to know what happened to Clara, never asked for details, just was there, present, attentive, respectful. Daniel, on the other hand, didn't dump his pain on her either. He wanted to get to know Helena the right way, with ease, with truth. And she responded with the same energy. One afternoon, they walked together along a trail near the lake, where the trees muffled the sounds of the city and created a space of rare peace. They sat on a half-hidden wooden bench and remained silent, enjoying the reflection of the leaves on the water. It was there that Daniel, for the first time, spoke of everything. Not as a confession, but as someone acknowledging their scars. He told her about the relationship, the breakup, the new beginning. Helena listened with steady eyes, without interrupting, without questioning. When he finished, she simply took his hand gently and said she admired his courage in having gone through everything and still being there, open to the new. She told him he deserved to be happy, not for having been hurt, but for choosing not to hurt in return. From that moment on, something changed between them. It wasn't an explosion, it wasn't a blind dive, it was a bond that grew stronger in silence, in the mutual exchange of care, in respect for each other's scars. They began to share more, sharing weekends, planning short trips. And with each encounter, Daniel realized there was room for a new love, not the same as the one he'd experienced with Clara, but new, unique, whole. And, above all, mutual. Meanwhile, Clara was plunged into a slow and cruel process of coming to terms with her loss. It wasn't enough to understand that she had lost Daniel. She had to deal with the fact that he was truly starting over, with someone else. And it wasn't just jealousy. It was a direct confrontation with the consequences of her choices. She tried to distract herself, engaging in other brief relationships, going out, traveling, but everything lacked substance. Faces blurred, voices seemed to echo. No hug brought the warmth she knew. No conversation reached the depth of what she had with Daniel. She began avoiding the places they frequented, erasing memories from her cell phones, hiding from mutual friends. The shame weighed more heavily than the pain. One rainy night, alone at home, Clara opened the box where she kept the few letters Daniel had written on their anniversary. She read them one by one, as if she could find some clue that there was still time. In each line, a version of herself that no longer existed. In each word, a reflection of what she had destroyed. She couldn't cry anymore. It was as if her regret had dried up even her tears. She spent hours sitting on the floor, the letters in her lap, staring at the ceiling in silence. The only thing left was guilt, and that wouldn't go away with time. A few weeks later, the three of them crossed paths again. It wasn't planned. The company where Clara still worked was holding a charity event, and Daniel and Helena were invited by mutual friends. When Clara saw them enter, her heart skipped a beat. Helena smiled lightly beside him, as if she belonged. Daniel held her hand discreetly but firmly. There was no tension between them, only complicity. Clara tried to hide it, looking away, but the image would be etched forever. During the event, they tried to avoid each other, but at one point, they crossed paths near the coffee area. It was inevitable. She said a simple, "Hi," and Daniel responded with a gentle wave. Helena also greeted her politely, without coldness or irony. Clara didn't know what to do. Her hands were sweaty, her heart racing. She wanted to run away, but something inside her urged dignity. They talked about the event, exchanged quick phrases. Helena politely stepped aside, leaving them both for a moment. Clara then looked at Daniel and said he seemed fine. He confirmed it with a brief smile and said he really was. That life was going smoothly. Clara held back tears and replied that she was trying to rebuild too, but knew it sounded forced. Daniel said nothing more. He simply wished her the best, sincerely. After saying goodbye, Clara walked to the bathroom, locked the door, and looked in the mirror. She no longer recognized that woman. She realized, with cruel clarity, that this man, who now belonged to someone else, was the same one she had scorned with gestures, silences, and poor choices. And the deepest pain wasn't the loss, but knowing he didn't hate her. That he had moved on. That there was no longer room for her, not even in his anger. Oblivion was the worst kind of ending. Outside, Daniel and Helena laughed together, making plans for the weekend. His smile was light, genuine, unclouded by the past. He no longer avoided the places that had once been scenes of pain. Now, they were just places. And Helena, without needing to erase the past, helped build a future. As he got into the car, Daniel looked at her and said something was different that night. Helena asked what it was, and he replied that, for the first time, he felt exactly where he was supposed to be. And this peace, which had previously seemed impossible, was now part of who he had become. And as the car drove away down the illuminated avenue, Clara remained behind, standing under the building's awning, staring into the void. There was nothing left to do. No letter to write, no request to make. The love she lost was no longer just a memory. It was now part of another story. A story that was no longer hers. A story that would never be hers again. The weeks that followed the event were marked by a definitive silence. Nothing more needed to be said, no word, gesture, or attempt to reclaim it would be enough to change what had already become firmly established. Daniel continued his routine without internal interruptions, not out of coldness, but because he had finally found a state of lucidity that prevented him from looking back. The wounds hadn't disappeared, but they had transformed into marks he carried with dignity, not as someone living with pain, but as someone who had survived it. He no longer avoided talking about what he'd experienced when the topic arose among close friends or in deeper conversations with Helena, but he also didn't insist on bringing it up. He had learned to respect his own history without allowing it to engulf him. With Helena, the relationship took the form of an everyday affection that didn't need to be constantly tested. There was trust, there was comfort, but there was also growth. She didn't treat him like someone to be saved, and he didn't see her as a replacement. They were both two whole people who chose to walk together based on what they had, not what they lost. In contrast, Clara now lived in a kind of emotional limbo. There was no hope left, but neither was there full acceptance. She knew, rationally, that Daniel had definitively started over, and that everything that had existed between them belonged to another time, but emotionally it was still as if part of her were trapped in a cycle of chronic regret. There were times when she accepted the end with an almost admirable sobriety, focusing on work, health, and getting her life back on track. But there were others when absence became a scream. The early mornings were long, and the days blurred into meaningless pursuits. She began attending meetings with people also seeking to rebuild after loss, initially at the suggestion of a coworker, but later because she realized she could be heard without judgment. At one of these meetings, she shared her story anonymously, using only the essentials. She spoke of the guilt, the brokenness, the wish she had done things differently. She didn't expect compassion or advice, just listening. And she was heard. As she left that room, she felt a discreet but new lightness, as if by exposing her truth she had taken a small step out of the darkness in which she had placed herself alone. Daniel, on the other hand, was beginning to experience small transformations. He was more sociable, more willing to step out of his comfort zone. He accepted an invitation to give a lecture on innovation and careers at a university, something he had always declined out of insecurity. Helena encouraged him naturally, without pushing, simply reminding him that he had something to say and that perhaps someone needed to hear it. He went, nervous at first, but surprised by his ability to connect with the students. In the end, he received messages thanking him for his words, and this moved him. It wasn't just about emotional overcoming. It was about reclaiming his own identity. He began planning old projects he had shelved, resumed abandoned hobbies, and reached out to family members he had neglected. The rebuilding wasn't just about love, but about his essence. It was as if a new kind of freedom now existed within him, born of pain but strengthened by the choice not to remain broken. Clara, on one of her darkest nights, rediscovered an old notebook she'd used during the early years of their relationship. Inside were loose texts, reflections, quotes marked from books, and, amidst it all, a simple list titled, "Things I Can't Lose." It was a short list, with items like mutual respect, admiration, companionship, and emotional honesty. Reading it, she realized she'd lost precisely everything she herself considered essential. And more than that, she'd given up those values for something that, looking back, was meaningless. The man who'd been key in destroying their relationship had long since disappeared. He'd disappeared after the cruel outcome, like someone fulfilling a role and disappearing at the end of the act. She, however, was left with the wreckage. She began writing about it, not with the intention of being read, but as a process of understanding. With each text, with each memory lucidly recovered, she understood that the greatest damage was not having lost Daniel, but having lost herself. Meanwhile, Helena and Daniel were getting closer and closer to the idea of building something more solid. It wasn't a rush or necessity, but a connection that developed naturally. He invited her to spend a weekend at his family's country house, a place he'd avoided since his breakup with Clara. The house was secluded, surrounded by tall trees and backed by a lake that reflected the stars at night. When they arrived, Daniel walked through each room calmly, as if recognizing a place of pain and transforming it into a space of healing. He showed Helena the places where he used to draw, the porch where he read on summer afternoons, the old, out-of-tune piano he'd never learned to play properly. She listened to him silently, smiling with her eyes, understanding that she was entering an intimate place, not just geographical, but emotional. On the second night, sitting by the fireplace, he recounted the details of the grieving process he'd experienced after the betrayal. He didn't speak of Clara with rancor, but with a clarity that only time allows. Helena listened attentively and, in the end, simply said that he was brave. Daniel, upon hearing this, felt something rare, pride in himself. The downward spiral set in, with a sense of a cycle nearing its end, but there were still gaps to be filled. Clara, in an attempt to rebuild, decided to quit the job where everything had fallen apart. She wanted to start over, somewhere she wouldn't be seen simply as the woman who lost a great love. She wanted to step out of the shadow of betrayal, rewrite her own story. She sent out resumes, went through interviews, and months later, landed a position at a small publishing house. The job was less glamorous, the pay more modest, but there was a sense of a true new beginning. Her colleagues didn't know her past. And this, for the first time, was liberating. Little by little, she began to reclaim parts of herself she had forgotten. She began to read with gusto again, to walk alone in the mornings, to drink coffee calmly, to laugh again, albeit subdued. On the other side, Helena and Daniel were planning a short trip to the coast, where he had spent a few summers as a teenager. It was a symbolic way to close the cycle. Taking someone new to an old place was, for Daniel, an act of profound healing. During the drive, they talked about the future, about what they wanted to build together. She didn't make hasty plans, he didn't create anxious expectations. They both understood that solidity came from slow steps. And there, on the road surrounded by trees and clear skies, Daniel felt a kind of peace he never imagined he would experience again. That same week, Clara received an unexpected invitation to speak at an event on ethics and choices in interpersonal relationships, organized by an institution that promoted debates on human values. Initially, she declined. She thought she had nothing to say. But then she reflected. Perhaps speaking was a way to free others from the same mistake. She nervously took the stage, paper in hand, but as she began to speak, she forgot her text. She spoke from the heart. She told her story as if confessing to herself. And in the end, she said that betrayal wasn't just an untimely kiss or a body in a different place. It was the silent abandonment of someone who still believed. It was the choice to break a promise that no one forces us to make, but which, once made, carries a weight that cannot be erased. When she finished, she was applauded. And she cried. Not for recognition, but because she finally felt she was turning a page. Each of them now walked a new path. Not parallel, not opposite. Just distinct. There were still memories that surfaced at certain moments, of course. But they didn't hurt as much as before. Daniel knew that his new beginning wouldn't erase the past. But he also knew that loving again wasn't betraying the memory of what he'd lived, it was honoring the life he still had to live. Clara, for her part, understood that the definitive loss of that love was her hardest lesson. And that it wasn't enough to mourn him, it was necessary to learn from him. And so the days went on, preparing for the final scene where the reunion with the truth, now free of hurt and guilt, would bring the closure they both needed, not to mend what was destroyed, but to understand, once and for all, that certain choices have no turning back, only consequences. And these, inevitably, shape us forever. In late autumn, the streets were already covered in yellowed leaves, pushed back and forth by the wind, as if trying to resist the fate of decaying over time. Daniel walked slowly through an open-air art fair with Helena, observing the stalls filled with paintings and sculptures. It was an ordinary Sunday, but it held a certain silent symbolism. Everything around them seemed charged with meaning, as if the world knew they had survived internal storms and could now simply exist. Helena took his hand and commented on a delicately crafted piece of wood. Daniel watched her as she spoke enthusiastically, unaware that, at that moment, he wasn't hearing the words, only her voice. It was as if he could finally be there fully, with no part of his heart wandering elsewhere. It was curious to think of how he had gotten here, after all, without carrying the weight of the past, but with the awareness of each step taken. That same day, in another part of the city, Clara was seeing an old friend she hadn't seen since college. The meeting had been arranged without much intention, simply through a quick message on social media that evolved into coffee. The conversation started out light, full of memories and superficial updates, but soon veered into the realm of deep topics, as almost always happens between two people who were once close and who, somehow, still recognize themselves in each other's pain. Clara didn't try to hide. She said she'd made a grave mistake, that she'd destroyed a relationship with an impulsive choice, and that she'd spent the last few months trying to reclaim her dignity. Her friend listened in silence, then smiled with a mixture of sadness and admiration and said it took courage to look at herself honestly. That conversation wouldn't change the course of Clara's life, but it would help ease the burden. It was the first time in a long time that she felt welcomed by someone who didn't see her as guilty or a victim, just as a woman who'd made a mistake and was now trying to be better. That same week, an unexpected invitation arrived in Clara's inbox. The school where she had attended as a teenager was holding a celebratory event and was gathering alumni for an exhibition about their paths after graduation. The email was standardized, sent to dozens of people, but it touched something deep inside her. For a moment, she considered ignoring it, but then decided to accept. She thought that revisiting that place would, in some way, be a way to reconnect with the purest version of herself, before everything, before Daniel, before the fall. When she arrived at her old school, she was greeted by teachers she barely recognized at first. There were photos on the walls, panels with quotes from former students, short videos projected with testimonials. Clara walked through the hallways with a bittersweet feeling. Every corner held a dormant memory, and as she walked through the courtyard, she found herself in front of the picture of her graduating class. The caption below her name read, "Determination, courage, and a sensitive heart." She read that sentence over and over again and felt a lump in her throat. Where had he lost all that? On the way home, Clara stopped in a quiet square and sat alone on a wooden bench. She looked up at the cloudy sky and allowed a few tears to fall. She was no longer crying for Daniel, but for herself. For having stopped being who she was, for having become hostage to her own haste, her own vanity, the desire to feel something new when, in fact, what she had was enough. It was a kind of grief not shared with others, because it stemmed from the realization that certain losses are direct consequences of who we choose to be. Meanwhile, Daniel and Helena were having dinner with mutual friends. Between laughter and glasses of wine, they talked about future trips and personal projects. Daniel participated lightly, but at one point, upon hearing one of his friends talk about long-term relationships that end over almost imperceptible details, he fell silent. He thought about how small things, left aside for too long, can turn into irreversible traps. This thought didn't sadden him, but rather made him more alert. He had learned, painfully, that love requires constant vigilance, not of the other, but of oneself. It demands daily choices, a commitment to truth, and, above all, the humility to recognize one's own limits. The next night, Clara was reviewing her resume for a position at a larger publishing house. She felt ready to try something new. The new routine in her more modest job had given her balance, but now she wanted more. Not out of vanity, but because she had finally regained her belief in her own worth. While organizing files on her computer, she stumbled upon an old photo of Daniel smiling next to a sculpture during a trip. It was one of those snapshots you don't plan, taken in a spontaneous moment. She stared at the screen for a few seconds, then closed the image and deleted it. Not with sadness, but with a quiet respect for everything she had experienced. Time was finally beginning to put her in the right place. Across town, Helena received difficult news. Her mother, who lived in another area, would need heart surgery, and she would have to be away for a few days to accompany her. Daniel insisted on going along, but she gently declined, saying it was something intimate and that she needed to face it with her sister. He understood, but felt uneasy. During the days he was alone again, he didn't feel the same way he had before, but he realized how familiar the silence still was. He used this time to organize his own emotional house. He reread the old notes Helena had left over the weeks, small pieces of paper with simple messages, stuck to the refrigerator, on the bedroom door, between the pages of books. In one of them, the phrase, "No matter how they've broken you, I only want to take care of what you still are." That touched him deeply, because that was what he had learned. There was no need to rebuild the old version of himself, but to honor the version that remained after the fall. When Helena returned, tired but relieved by her mother's recovery, she found Daniel with flowers and dinner ready. She smiled in surprise and said she didn't need so much. He replied that he did. Because now he knew how to appreciate the gestures that, in the past, he thought would always be there. They sat, ate, and talked at length. And at the end, Daniel held her hand and said he wanted something more. Not in a rush, but truthfully. That he wanted to walk beside her consciously, without ghosts, without fantasies. Helena, moved, simply nodded. It was as if everything had finally found its place. That same weekend, Clara received a call from her brother, who lived in another state, inviting her to spend a few days with him and his nephews. It had been years since she'd seen her family up close. She accepted. She needed some time away from everything, from all the places that reminded her of what she'd lost. She traveled with a light suitcase and a weary mind, but upon arrival, she was greeted with warm hugs, freshly brewed coffee, and familiar voices. He slept like he hadn't slept in a long time. In those days, she understood that starting over wasn't about erasing, but about reorganizing what was left. She watched movies with her nephews, cooked with her sister-in-law, and laughed with her brother. She spoke little about the past because no one there demanded explanations. Just acceptance. And that was what she needed. Upon returning, Clara went through a new selection process. She got the job. She would start in a month. New city, new cycle. It was time to go. Before leaving, she went to the lake she used to visit with Daniel in years past, sat alone, and wrote a letter. Not to him, but to herself. A letter of forgiveness. And when she finished, she put it in an envelope and threw it into the calm waters. I no longer needed to keep anything. I was finally free. Not because I had stopped loving, but because I had understood that there are loves that never return, and that, even so, life goes on. That same day, Daniel was making travel plans with Helena. They talked about visiting the South, seeing snow, living out the little dreams he thought he'd never have again. There was no euphoria, but there was peace. And this peace, he now knew, was the true end to pain. Rebuilding wasn't about places, people, or promises, but about the firm choice not to repeat one's mistakes, not to allow oneself to be carried away by one's emotional comfort zone again. He had learned the difference between forgiving and losing oneself. He had learned the difference between insisting and persisting. He had learned that true love is remaining faithful to what one builds. Everything was now moving toward the natural conclusion of a cycle. A cycle that didn't require major upheavals, just exposed truths, healed wounds, and conscious choices. The past no longer held anyone back. And the future, finally, could be written without fear. Winter arrived slowly, unhurriedly, as if each colder morning were a silent reminder that everything, even that which seemed eternal, one day changes. And with the cold, came the final point of all that had been built, destroyed, and begun again. A complete cycle, not in circles, but in a spiral, where each turn brought a new understanding. Clara, with her bags packed and a move scheduled for a week later, decided to visit for the last time the places that had once marked her history with Daniel. Not to seek nostalgia, but to say goodbye. She passed the park where they used to walk on Sunday mornings, sat on the stone bench where he proposed, and then walked to the old bookstore where they had met. The place was closed, its windows covered with "For Rent" notices. She smiled sadly, because perhaps that was the cruelest symbol of everything she had experienced, a place full of stories, now closed, silent, forgotten. On his way home, he passed in front of their building and stopped for a few minutes on the other side of the street. There was no attempt to go up, to find him again. There was no more room for that. He just stood there, observing the facade as if looking back at the past and finally accepting that it could no longer be touched. That very day, Daniel was experiencing a moment of personal transition. He had received an offer to coordinate a new project in another city, something that involved more than professional changes. It was an opportunity to finally close the last chapter of his old story. He and Helena had discussed the proposal at length and concluded that it was the right time. Helena, who had experienced her own processes of loss and reconstruction before meeting him, knew how to recognize the signs of a new beginning. They decided to move together. Lightly, calmly, with plans made without haste. The day before the move, Daniel was organizing boxes in the living room when he found, at the bottom of a drawer, an old photo that had escaped all the previous cleaning. It was a portrait of him and Clara, taken by a friend on a random afternoon. They were both laughing, carefree, full of a future that now no longer existed. He stared at the image for a few seconds and then put it away in a folder with old documents. He didn't tear it, didn't burn it. He simply put it back where it was. Because some memories don't need to be erased, just return to the place where they no longer hurt. Clara left 2 days later, without formal goodbyes. She moved alone, starting over in a city where no one knew her, where no one had expectations of her. She found a simple house, a new job, and gradually rebuilt her own routine. She discovered a small book club, made new friends, enrolled in singing lessons, and began giving voluntary lectures on emotional ethics. She spoke with authority not from training, but from lived experience. And although she didn't name names, she used her story to show the importance of choosing consciously. She was listened to with respect. And this helped her keep going. One night, after one of these lectures, a young woman approached to thank her and asked if she regretted everything. Clara smiled wearily and replied that yes, she deeply regretted it, but that the true punishment wasn't the regret. It was the fact that, even having learned, she could never undo what had been done. And so, now, she made a point of transforming her pain into a warning. Because not everyone gets the chance to do things differently after destroying something. Now in their new city, Daniel and Helena were beginning to establish a new routine. The house was smaller, the furniture wasn't all in place yet, but there was warmth in the details. They cooked together, laughed amidst the mess, hung pictures at unlikely times, like someone who understands that true home isn't on the walls, but in the people you choose to have around you. One morning, Daniel woke before dawn, made coffee, and sat on the porch, gazing out at the empty street. He reflected on everything he'd experienced, not with sadness, but with quiet gratitude. Because now I knew what it meant to love with integrity, I knew the weight and value of trust, and more than that, I knew how devastating it is to lose everything because of a wrong choice. Helena appeared a few minutes later, wrapped in a thick coat, and sat beside him, resting her head on his shoulder. They spoke little. Sometimes, the silences between them said everything. Months later, Clara was walking through a literary event where an author was talking about loss and new beginnings. In one of the hallways, she stopped when she saw a poster with a phrase that seemed to have been written directly to her: "Some scars aren't meant to be hidden. They're meant to keep us from forgetting." She stood there for a while, thinking about how much she still carried scars, but how they were now more guides than burdens. That night, she wrote a text about it. She published it on her personal blog, and for the first time, she felt like she was writing not to vent, but to move on. A friend commented that she seemed different. She replied that she was now at peace, because she finally understood that true forgiveness begins when we forgive ourselves for having allowed ourselves to forget who we are. Some time later, without warning, Clara received a message from Daniel. It was brief, respectful. It simply said that he had read a text of hers at the suggestion of a friend and that he was happy to see she had found a path. There was no overt emotion, no ulterior motives. It was simply a symbolic bridge between two pasts that were now heading in opposite directions. Clara read the message several times before responding. And when she did, she simply thanked him, wishing him continued well and that he would build everything he deserved. It was the end of a chapter, finally written with maturity. Time passed. And with it, the past became part of the story, but no longer its center. Daniel and Helena, a year after moving, traveled abroad for the first time. It had been an old plan, but now it made sense. They visited museums, walked unfamiliar streets, learned new words. And in each new landscape, Daniel looked at her with the certainty that it wasn't luck that had brought him there. It was the courage to not let himself be destroyed. Helena, in turn, knew that by welcoming a marked man, she also found in him the opportunity to experience an honest love, with a past, yes, but without lies. Clara published her first book 2 years after the move. A chronicle of loss and learning, it quickly found a loyal readership. In interviews, she said she wrote so she wouldn't forget who she chose to be every day. She never loved like she loved Daniel again, and perhaps never would again, but she learned that self-love is the starting point for any other possible love. And now, with time on her side, she was building a new story, not to make up for the old one, but to honor who she became after the fall. This story ends with each character in their place. Daniel, rebuilt, loving again. Helena, finally being loved completely. Clara, living with the knowledge that she destroyed a great love, but rebuilt herself on its ashes, with dignity. Because the true impact of betrayal lies not only in the pain it causes the other, but in the silent loss it leaves in the betrayer. When the bond of trust is broken, love doesn't die immediately, it slowly rots, until nothing remains but the memory of something that was once beautiful, but now only hurts. There is no shortcut back. There is no forgiveness that can bring back time. What exists is the consequence. Comment below what you thought of this story. We want to hear your opinion, it's important to us. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, subscribe now. Here you'll always find intense, real stories with lasting lessons. And remember, betrayal destroys. It tears out trust, respect, admiration, and love by the roots. It destroys homes, dreams, and the best thing that exists between two people, the peace of being able to close your eyes knowing the other person is truly by your side. Therefore, this channel does not support, normalize, and will never romanticize any type of betrayal. Consider, some choices cannot be undone. And those who learn this too late spend their lives trying to rebuild what they threw away with their own hands.